My name is Margaret Louise Anderson. I am 73 years old, and for 45 years, I worked as a teacher in an elementary school in Cedar Hill, a small but bustling town just outside of Dallas, Texas, where the summers are long and unforgiving, and the winters bring a sharp wind that slices through the cracks of the old wooden houses built by hardworking families like mine. I live in the same red brick home with a wraparound porch that my late husband William and I bought in 1978 with every penny we had scraped together, a house where we raised our only daughter Angela, where we planted magnolia trees out back that still bloom creamy white flowers every spring, where the creak of the front porch swing has been the soundtrack to decades of birthdays, anniversaries, and quiet afternoons with a glass of sweet tea in hand, and where I thought I would live out my final years surrounded by love and visits from my grandkids, not betrayal so deep it felt like someone had reached into my chest and ripped out my heart. It was a crisp October morning, the kind that makes you grateful for warm socks and the smell of fresh coffee percolating in the kitchen, when the world I thought I knew collapsed like a tower of cards. And I remember every detail of that morning with a clarity that feels like a scar branded into my memory, from the way the sunlight filtered through the lace curtains of my living room, to the faint hum of the old refrigerator that has served me faithfully since the early 90s, to the way my hand trembled as I folded the local paper, the Dallas Morning News, setting it on the side table next to a framed photo of Angela and her wedding dress with Mark by her side, both of them beaming at me like nothing bad could ever happen in our family. I was still in my favorite chair, an old wooden rocker that had soothed me through the long nights when Angela had fevers as a child, when I heard the distinct sound of the gate outside, that squeaky, metallic scrape that I never got around to fixing because it was my little reminder that someone was coming home. But this time, the sound did not bring joy. It carried a weight I didn't recognize at first. The door opened, and in walked Angela, my only daughter, dressed to the nines as always, with her designer handbag slung carelessly over her arm and her hair styled in those big, blonde curls she pays too much for at the salon, her sunglasses still perched on her face even though she was inside, and right behind her came Mark, my son-in-law, wearing his neatly pressed button-down and those polished leather shoes that always clicked loudly on my hardwood floor, as though he wanted the whole house to know he had arrived. I noticed immediately how stiff their bodies were, like actors stepping onto a stage for a performance they had rehearsed, and my heart sank because instinct told me this was no ordinary visit. No drop in to check on Mama, no chance to sit at the table and laugh over biscuits and gravy, but something orchestrated, calculated, and cold. "Mom," Angela said, her voice clipped, not even bothering to kiss me on the cheek the way she used to when she was younger, and she sat herself down on the couch with that practiced grace of someone who believed she was owed the best seat in the room, while Mark hovered by her side, carrying a leather portfolio, his expression serious, as if he were about to present me with a business proposal rather than visit the woman who had given birth to his wife.
"We need to talk to you about something important," she continued, adjusting her sunglasses so that when her eyes finally met mine, they were sharp and assessing rather than warm. I set the paper down, feeling the weight of dread pool in my stomach, and asked what they meant, though my voice already quivered with unease. And that was when Mark, always the smoother of the two, placed the portfolio on the coffee table and slid a few documents toward me with a kind of deliberate slowness meant to underscore importance. "Margaret, you're 73 now, and we've noticed you've been living alone in this big house," he began, his tone condescending in its softness, as though speaking to a child who didn't understand. "We're worried about you, about your memory, about how you're handling things." And before I could protest, Angela leaned forward, placing her manicured hands on her knees, that same sugary tone she had used as a little girl when she wanted something expensive, sneaking back into her words. "Mom, don't you think it would be better if we helped you? We could put the accounts in our names too, just in case something happens. That way there won't be any complications later." And though I didn't yet know exactly what game they were playing, I knew in my bones this was no act of love. This was the opening move in a plot. And the realization sent a chill down my spine like an icy draft through an open window. "Something happens?" I repeated, my voice louder now, my indignation pushing past the lump in my throat, and Mark seized the opportunity to lay down the final blow of the rehearsed script by pulling out the sheet that itemized my late husband's estate, every property, every savings account, every investment, totaling nearly $10 million, money that William and I had scraped and sacrificed for through decades of double shifts, thrift store bargains, skipped vacations, and hard nights counting coins at this very table to plan a future we thought we were securing for our family. My breath caught as I realized the truth. My daughter and son-in-law hadn't come because they missed me, hadn't come to ask how I'd slept, hadn't come to bring me my favorite pecan pie from the diner. They had come for my money, plain and simple. And the daughter I had raised with bedtime stories, scraped knees, kissed better, and every ounce of love I had was now looking at me as though I were nothing more than an inconvenient obstacle standing between her and her fortune. While Mark, my son-in-law whom I'd once welcomed into this home with pride, now spoke of my life's work like it was an unclaimed prize to be redistributed to the younger, more capable hands. I stared at those papers, spread across my coffee table, each line of legal jargon a dagger slicing through the fragile hope that my family was still bound by love rather than greed. And as I sat there in that old rocker where I had once held Angela in my arms during thunderstorms, whispering promises that I would always protect her, I realized with a hollow ache that nothing in the world could have prepared me for this moment. The moment my own child, the one I had sacrificed everything for, would sit in my living room and tell me that I had already lived enough, that my wisdom and my years were nothing but liabilities, that I should hand over the keys to my life because in their eyes I was no longer capable, no longer worthy, and that the love I thought eternal had been replaced by calculation, entitlement, and betrayal so sharp it cut deeper than any wound I had ever known.
The weeks that followed that first confrontation in my living room became a blur of false smiles, staged kindness, and little manipulations that at first I wanted so desperately to mistake for love. Because what mother willingly admits that her only daughter and the man she married are plotting against her? Yet slowly, like a sickness that spreads through the body unnoticed until it consumes you, I began to recognize the patterns, the rehearsed conversations, the calculated touches on my shoulder that came only when Angela wanted access to my bank statements, or when Mark slid his laptop onto my kitchen table like it was his private office, explaining in that syrupy voice that, "We're just here to help, Mom. Don't stress yourself with numbers at your age," as though the woman who had balanced a teacher's salary and a construction worker's husband's overtime shifts, who had saved penny by penny to put Angela through private school when the public one cut its art program, and who had refinanced the house to help them buy their first condo, could suddenly not understand basic arithmetic. They brought croissants from the bakery downtown, Angela's favorite place where she always overpaid to show off her refined taste. They hugged me tighter than usual, and all the while I, foolish and hopeful, gave them every password they asked for, every document they requested because they told me it would make life easier. And I wanted so badly to believe that their sudden attentiveness was born of care, not calculation. One afternoon, Mark installed an app on my phone saying it was to track my steps and remind me about medications, and I smiled at what I thought was his thoughtfulness, not realizing until much later that the app also logged my calls and my location so they could monitor my movements, as though I were a child needing supervision. And when Angela convinced me to switch doctors, telling me that my longtime physician, Dr. Matthews, was too old-fashioned and not up to date with modern geriatric care, I foolishly agreed, only to learn months later that the new doctor was one of Mark's golf buddies, a man who, for the right amount of money, was willing to write medical notes hinting at memory lapses and cognitive decline I never had. And though I brushed off the little slights, the slowed speech from Angela when she explained things I already knew, the repeated reminders, "In case you forgot, Mom," the looks they exchanged when I told a story as if they were checking if I still made sense, the truth crashed into me one Friday when my grandson Ethan, their sweet 8-year-old boy with hair the color of wheat fields and eyes as wide as saucers, came to visit after school still in his rumpled uniform polo with a cartoon patch on the chest, and sat beside me on the porch swing where we used to drink chocolate milkshakes in the summer, fiddling nervously with the straps of his backpack before blurting out, "Grandma, is it true you're sick in your head?" And when I asked him where he had heard such a thing, his little voice, full of innocence, whispered, "Daddy says you forget stuff all the time, and that's why he and Mom have to take care of your money." And my chest constricted as though someone had sat an anvil on it, because not only were they trying to strip me of my autonomy, they were rewriting my image in the mind of the one soul in this family who still looked at me with pure love, my grandson, planting seeds of doubt that his grandmother was senile, untrustworthy, a danger to herself, so that even in his tender heart their betrayal would appear justified. I took his little face between my hands, the same hands that had once tied his shoelaces and taught him how to find ladybugs in the garden, and I asked, "Do you think Grandma forgets things, sweetheart? Do you believe I'm sick?" And his eyes confused stared back at me as he whispered, "I don't know. You always remember my birthday and my teacher's name and when I have soccer, But Daddy says he knows more than me. And in that moment, I realized they weren't just after money. They were after my legacy, after the way history would remember me, trying to turn me into the crazy old lady no one believed so that when they finally seized everything William and I had built, no one would question their righteousness. That night, after Ethan left with his eyes clouded by confusion he never should have carried, I sat in my bedroom staring at the photographs on the wall. Angela on her prom night in a dress I had spent months sewing by hand, Mark shaking William's hand at the wedding reception, little Ethan blowing out candles on his third birthday cake, and I wept silently into the pillow, not from old age or loneliness, but from the crushing betrayal of realizing that the people I had poured every ounce of my life into had decided I was an inconvenience to be erased. Then came the Thursday when my neighbor, Mrs. Johnson, a woman I had shared blog parties, church bake sales, and countless cups of coffee with over 40 years, knocked at my door holding a steaming mug and a furrowed brow. "Margaret, I hate to meddle, but I saw Angela and Mark bringing a man into your house while you were out. They were taking pictures, moving things around like they were planning a sale or something." And my blood ran cold as she went on to tell me that she had also seen them at the local bank asking questions about procedures for declaring an elderly relative legally incapacitated. Words that slammed into me like a freight train because suddenly all the pieces fell into place. The new doctor, the staged concern, the whispers of forgetfulness. It was all part of a larger plan, not just to steal my money, but to strip me of my very personhood, to make me legally a child again, someone who needed a guardian, someone who couldn't sign her own checks or decide what to eat for dinner, someone who would be locked away in a nursing home while they siphoned off the fruits of my life's work. And that night, I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window with the cold glow of the moon illuminating the stack of family photos on my lap, asking myself over and over how my daughter, the little girl I had walked to kindergarten, defended against bullies, and sacrificed sleep and health for, had become the architect of such cruelty. And when the sun finally rose, spilling pale light over my magnolia blossoms, I knew deep in my bones that my battle had only just begun, and that if I didn't find the strength to fight back, I would lose not just my house and my savings, but my very identity, erased by the greed of the two people I had once trusted more than anyone in the world. The morning after my sleepless night, when the magnolia petals looked like ghosts scattered across my backyard, I sat at my kitchen table with a pot of coffee that had gone cold, staring at my checkbook and the neat rows of numbers that, for decades, had represented stability, security, and the pride of being able to stand on my own 2 feet, and I thought about how many sacrifices William and I had made to keep this house and to put Angela through college. How many nights he worked double shifts at the construction site. How many evenings I graded papers until my eyes blurred. How many vacations we postponed and luxuries we denied ourselves so that one day our daughter could live better than we had. And it made me sick to realize that she and Mark had twisted that dream into a weapon to use against me. But I wasn't ready to roll over, not yet. So I pulled out the old wooden box from the hall closet where William and I kept our most important documents: deeds, insurance policies, savings bonds, even letters from lawyers that we had saved over the years. And as I thumbed through the papers, I felt both relief and terror when I came across the original deed to the house, still in my name alone, untouched by all the signatures Angela and Mark had tried to coax out of me in the last few weeks. And I realized that, for now at least, my fortress still stood under my control, though I could feel their pressure like termites chewing at the foundation. I decided that morning to pay a visit to the bank downtown, a solid limestone building that had stood on Main Street since the 50s, where I had opened my first savings account as a teenager and where, for decades, the tellers knew me by name. And as I walked through the heavy brass doors with my cane tapping against the marble floor, I reminded myself that I was not crazy, not incompetent, not the frail old woman they were painting me to be, but Margaret Anderson, who had raised a child alone after William's sudden heart attack in 1994, who had balanced lesson plans and bills while still making it to every soccer game, who had survived cancer at 59 and walked out of the hospital determined to keep living. At the bank, I asked to speak with Mr. Harris, the branch manager, a kind man with graying hair who had watched Angela grow up and who greeted me with a smile that faltered slightly when I told him why I had come. Because apparently, Angela and Mark had already been there, inquiring about transferring funds, asking what it would take to gain access to accounts if a relative were declared mentally incompetent, and my voice trembled with indignation as I demanded to know what they had been told. But Mr. Harris, bound by protocol, could only assure me that no changes had been made yet, though the seed of dread took root in me, because it meant their plan was further along than I realized. That afternoon, I went to see an attorney, Mr. Douglas, whose office sat above the diner where William and I used to get Sunday breakfast, and as I sat across from his polished oak desk, I spilled every detail: the sudden concern, the staged kindness, the documents on my table, the app on my phone, even the heartbreaking words from little Ethan. And as I spoke, he nodded gravely, taking notes in his neat script, and when I finally finished, exhausted and trembling, he leaned back in his chair and said words that confirmed my deepest fear. "Mrs. Anderson, it sounds like your daughter and son-in-law may be preparing to file for guardianship over you, which would essentially strip you of the right to control your finances, your property, even your medical decisions. They would become your legal custodians, and you'd need their permission for almost everything." My mouth went dry, my palms sweaty against the arms of the chair, as I imagined myself locked away in some sterile nursing facility, my home sold to strangers, my grandson told that Grandma wasn't well enough to see him, and I swore right then and there that I would not let it happen, not after everything I had endured, not after all the love I had poured into this family. Mr. Douglas advised me to gather evidence. Any documents, recordings, witnesses that could prove I was still of sound mind and capable of handling my affairs. And he suggested I update my will and establish a living trust that placed my estate in the hands of someone I could truly rely on, perhaps a close friend or even a professional trustee, someone Angela and Mark couldn't manipulate. And as I left his office with a folder of papers tucked under my arm, I felt a flicker of strength in my chest, like the first spark of a fire that could still be kindled. That night, alone in my living room with the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence, I wrote, page after page in a spiral notebook, documenting everything. Dates, conversations, suspicious actions, because I knew that if this went to court, I would need more than tears and broken trust. I would need hard evidence to stand up against my own flesh and blood. And though my hands cramped from the effort, I kept writing, my determination fueled by anger, betrayal, and the faint hope that maybe, just maybe, I could outwit them. But even as I plotted my defense, the assaults kept coming. Angela calling me 3 times a day to check in, her voice dripping with false sweetness as she asked me to repeat what I had eaten for lunch as though testing my memory. Mark showing up unannounced with maintenance men to inspect the house, thinly veiled excuses to snoop through my belongings, and Ethan, sweet Ethan, pulled further and further from me with excuses about soccer practice or homework whenever I asked to see him, until my porch swing sat empty, swaying in the autumn wind like a reminder of all I stood to lose. And yet, despite the isolation, despite the gnawing fear, I began to feel a strange kind of resolve harden inside me. Because if they thought they could erase me quietly, shuffle me off like an old piece of furniture, they were about to learn that Margaret Anderson might be old, but she was not broken, and she was not done fighting. Not by a long shot.
2 weeks later, just as the leaves in Cedar Hill turned brittle and painted the sidewalks in shades of burnt orange and rust, the trap Angela and Mark had been leaving finally began to close around me, though by then I had already started laying snares of my own. It was a Tuesday morning when a thick envelope arrived by certified mail, the kind that makes your stomach tighten before you even sign for it, and inside was a notice from the county court. My daughter and son-in-law had officially filed a petition for guardianship, claiming that I was no longer capable of managing my own affairs due to advanced cognitive decline, attaching affidavits from Mark's golfing buddy of a doctor who had written that I was forgetful, confused, and prone to irrational decisions, words that made my hands shake with fury because never once had I forgotten to pay a bill, never once had I lost my way driving to the church, never once had I confused my grandson's name or birthday, and yet here on legal letterhead I was being painted as a shell of myself.
I sat at the kitchen table, reading and rereading the pages until the words blurred, wondering how my life had come to this point. How the daughter I had raised on bedtime stories and Sunday school lessons could stand in front of a judge and say that I, her mother, was unfit to decide what to eat for breakfast, unfit to choose when to go to bed, unfit to walk out onto my own porch without permission. But once the first wave of shock subsided, a colder, sharper determination took over because I remembered Mr. Douglas's advice and knew that this was the moment my preparation mattered most. I dialed his number with trembling fingers, and within an hour I was in his office, handing over the envelope, my notebook full of dates and observations, the deed to my house, and even a small flash drive my neighbor Mrs. Johnson had given me, which held photographs she had snapped on her phone of Angela and Mark, showing strangers around my living room like real estate agents while I was out at the grocery store. Proof that they had already begun trying to sell the home that was legally still mine. Mr. Douglas's face hardened as he scrolled through the images, and he told me calmly, "We can fight this, Mrs. Anderson, but you must be ready. It will get ugly, and they will not hesitate to drag your name through the mud." That night, alone again with the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the old wall clock, I prayed harder than I had in years, asking William, wherever he was, to give me strength, to stand by me as I fought for the life we had built together. And as the shadows stretched long across the floorboards, I swore that I would not be silenced, not pushed aside like yesterday's newspaper. When the court date arrived 2 weeks later, I put on my best navy blue dress, the one I had worn to Ethan's baptism, and pinned my silver hair neatly back, determined to show the world and my betrayers that Margaret Anderson was not the fragile caricature they painted. Walking into the courthouse, my cane tapping against the marble floor, I felt the weight of decades on my shoulders, but I also felt the fiery resolve of every woman who has ever had to fight to be heard. Angela was already seated at the petitioner's table, her blonde curls perfectly styled, her designer suit tailored to perfection, Mark beside her with that smug half-smile that made my blood boil, and when their eyes met mine, I saw no shame, no hesitation, only calculation. The hearing began with their lawyer painting a picture of a confused old woman who left stoves burning, who forgot to lock doors, who misplaced large sums of money, each lie another dagger twisting in my chest. And then Angela herself took the stand, her voice syrupy with feigned concern as she described me as once a wonderful mother, but now someone who just isn't the same. And I wanted to stand up and shout, to tell the judge about the lies, the manipulations, the photos of strangers touring my house, but Mr. Douglas squeezed my hand, reminding me to wait, to let the truth unfold in its time. When it was our turn, he presented the deed, the photographs, and even a statement from Mrs. Johnson, who testified about what she had seen with her own eyes, her voice shaking both with nerves and righteous indignation, as she said, "I've known Margaret for 40 years, and she remembers more than I do half the time. If anyone's confused, it's those two, confused by greed." The courtroom buzzed as Mr. Douglas then played a short audio recording he had helped me capture, a snippet from a conversation when Angela had slipped, her voice caught on tape hissing, "The sooner we get her declared incompetent, the sooner we can cash out." And I watched as the color drained from Mark's face while Angela clenched her jaw, her composure cracking just enough for the judge to notice. My heart pounded as I finally took the stand, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands, and I told the story of my life. The decades of teaching, the years of sacrifice with William, the cancer I had fought and survived, the bills I had paid down to the last cent, the lessons I had taught Angela about honesty and compassion, and as I spoke, I saw the judge's eyes soften, as though he could see not just an old woman, but a lifetime of dignity under siege. By the time the hearing ended, the petition was not granted. Not that day, at least, and though the fight was far from over, I walked out of that courthouse with my head held high, knowing that for now, my name, my rights in my home were still mine, and that Angela and Mark had underestimated the one thing they should have feared most, a mother who has nothing left to lose but her own dignity and who will fight to her last breath to keep it. In the days after the first court hearing, Cedar Hill seemed smaller, as though every corner whispered about my family's betrayal. Yet in that same shrinking space, I began to find unexpected allies. people who had watched me walk these streets for decades and were not so quick to believe the lies Angela and Mark tried to spread. At the grocery store, Mrs. Collins, who had once taught Sunday school with me, slipped her hand over mine at the checkout and said softly, "We know who you are, Margaret. Don't let them break you." And at church, Pastor Reynolds gave a sermon about wolves in sheep's clothing that seemed aimed straight at me. His gaze lingering on Angela, who still dared to show up in the front pew as if she were the victim. But despite these small comforts, the battle inside my home grew fiercer, because Angela and Mark had not been humiliated enough to retreat. They doubled down, showing up at odd hours, Mark pounding on my front door claiming he needed to check the wiring, Angela insisting she had to help organize my pantry, and though I wanted to slam the door in their faces, I forced myself to smile and let them hang themselves with their own rope, because Mr. Douglas had advised me that gathering evidence was my sharpest weapon. And so I kept my phone nearby at all times, recording conversations, snapping photos, and even keeping copies of every note they left on my counter, which often dripped with passive aggression disguised as care. Like the time Angela wrote, "Mom, you forgot to take your pill again. I'll set reminders since you clearly can't keep track," when in truth I had taken it right on time. My nights were lonelier than ever, filled with the groans of the old house and the whisper of the wind through the magnolias, but my resolve hardened, and I began to pour myself into creating a living trust with Mr. Douglas, one that would place my assets beyond Angela and Mark's reach by naming an independent trustee from the firm, a man with no ties to my family who would execute my wishes as written. It was a painful decision, like cutting away a limb, because no mother dreams of disinheriting a child, but as I signed those documents with steady hands, I told myself that my bloodline did not excuse betrayal, and that legacy meant nothing if it ended up funding greed rather than love. Still, Angela sensed the shift. Mothers and daughters always know each other's rhythms, and one evening she arrived alone, without Mark, wearing that soft blue sweater I had bought her for her 40th birthday, trying to resurrect the little girl I once adored, her eyes glistening as she sat across from me at the kitchen table and whispered, "Mom, why are you doing this to me? Haven't I been a good daughter?" And for a moment, my heart cracked, because I remembered her pigtails, her laugh, the way she once clung to me after nightmares. But then I recalled Ethan's confused little face when he asked if I was sick in the head, and I realized that her tears were as rehearsed as her courtroom lies. So I steeled myself and answered quietly, "A good daughter doesn't try to erase her mother." And the mask slipped, her mouth tightening as she hissed, "You'll regret this," before storming out into the night, her car tires screeching against the curb. That was the moment I understood there was no going back, no reconciliation, only survival. And so I began to prepare in earnest, copying every file onto flash drives, storing them in safe deposit boxes, even giving duplicates to Mrs. Johnson across the street in case anything happened to me. I also started seeing Ethan in secret, meeting him at the park after school when Angela thought he was at a friend's house. And in those brief stolen hours, we played catch, ate ice cream, and I whispered truths into his ear. Not bitter venom about his parents, but reminders of who I was, of the love I had given him, of the fact that Grandma was not sick, that Grandma remembered every detail of his life, and his little hands would grip mine tightly, his eyes bright with trust. And those moments fueled me more than any legal strategy could. Yet, the storm kept building, because Angela and Mark filed appeal after appeal, dragging me back into hearings, their lawyer waving new evidence like the time they claimed I had forgotten to pay the electric bill, which I easily disproved with a receipt, or the time they accused me of wandering the streets confused, when in fact I had been walking to the library, a place I had visited every week for 40 years. Each lie was another knife in my back, but with each truth I presented, the judge's patience with them thinned, and I could feel momentum shifting, though not without cost, because gossip spread fast in our small town, and there were whispers in the pews, at the diner, even at the hair salon, people asking if Margaret Anderson had really lost her mind, and it stung deeply. But I reminded myself that the only way to silence the whispers was to keep standing, to keep proving, to keep breathing, until no one could deny my strength. And so, as winter crept in and frost laced the edges of my magnolias, I stood taller than I had in years, even as the two people who should have loved me most worked tirelessly to bury me alive. Because deep inside, I knew the tide was turning, and I would not let go of the fight until every last lie they told collapsed under the weight of my truth. By the time January arrived and Cedar Hill was glazed with ice that sparkled cruelly under the streetlights, the war within my own bloodline had grown into something that consumed every hour of my life, and yet with each passing day I felt more certain that I was not only fighting for myself, but for every older woman in our town who had ever been told she was slipping just because she had wrinkles around her eyes. Angela and Mark pressed harder than ever, showing up at church with carefully rehearsed stories about how worried they were for me, whispering in neighbors' ears about how I had supposedly left the stove burning or forgotten where I parked my car, planting seeds of doubt in every corner of my community. And though some people looked at me sideways now, I forced myself to hold my head high, to walk into the sanctuary with my Bible and sit in my usual pew, reminding everyone with my presence that I was still here, still strong, still Margaret Anderson. Meanwhile, Mr. Douglas and I built case after case, filing countersuits and presenting fresh evidence, phone recordings where Angela's voice slipped into venom, photographs of strangers touring my house, receipts that proved every bill was paid on time, even testimony from Dr. Matthews, my longtime physician, who had returned from his medical mission abroad and was horrified to learn that his absence had been exploited to fabricate a diagnosis. He marched into court one morning with my medical file in hand, his voice thunderous as he declared, "This woman is healthier and sharper than half the patients I see 20 years younger." And I watched Angela's face twist with rage as their carefully constructed narrative cracked in front of the judge. But they were relentless, and the cruelty of their strategy reached a new low when I discovered that they had tried to enroll me in an assisted living facility without my knowledge, signing preliminary forms and even scheduling a tour on my behalf. Documents I only found because Mrs. Johnson intercepted mail while I was visiting the library and brought it to me in trembling hands, whispering, "Margaret, they're trying to lock you away." For a moment, I couldn't breathe, picturing myself behind sterile walls cut off from my home, my magnolias, my grandson, erased from my own life. And that image fueled a fire in me that I hadn't felt in years, a fire that roared when I stood before the judge at the next hearing and declared, "I am not incompetent, I am not confused, and I will not be silenced while my own child attempts to bury me alive." My voice echoing through the wood-paneled courtroom until even the bailiff looked at me with respect. Still, the emotional toll was brutal, and the loneliness of my empty house pressed against me at night like a heavy blanket. The silence broken only by the hum of appliances and the faint creak of the porch swing in the winter wind. But even in those darkest hours, I found sparks of strength. Phone calls from Ethan whispered from his bedroom after his parents thought he was asleep, telling me, "Grandma, I love you. Don't let them win." Or the small circle of women at church who left casseroles on my doorstep with notes that read, "We believe you." One evening, sitting at my kitchen table with a plate of untouched pot roast and the glow of a single lamp, I realized that this battle had transformed me, that the woman who once lived quietly, content to fade into the rhythm of small-town life, had become someone fierce, someone who could stare down lies in a courtroom, someone who would rather burn every dollar of her estate than let it be stolen by greedy hands. And though the fight was far from over, I knew then that I had already won something they could never take: my dignity, my voice, my refusal to vanish quietly into the night. By early spring, when the magnolias bloomed again in my backyard and their petals scattered across the grass like confetti, the battle that had begun quietly in my living room now exploded into a public war that everyone in Cedar Hill could see. Because Angela and Mark, humiliated by their failed attempts in court, turned to more desperate measures, filing false reports with Adult Protective Services, claiming I was living in unsafe conditions, going so far as to stage photographs of my kitchen counter with spoiled food they themselves had left behind after one of their visits. And one Saturday morning, a social worker appeared at my door, clipboard in hand, apologetic but bound by duty to inspect my home. I welcomed her in with a calm smile, offering her coffee as I guided her through every room, each one spotless and in order, my bills neatly stacked, my refrigerator full of fresh groceries. And by the time she left, she said softly, "Mrs. Anderson, it's clear you're just fine, but I want you to know this happens more than people realize." And in her eyes, I saw both pity and admiration, because she recognized the strength it took to stand alone against family betrayal. Still, the shame of having my private life dragged through the mud in front of strangers weighed heavy, and I found myself walking through town with whispers, following me like shadows. But rather than shrink, I stood taller, greeting everyone with a steady gaze, because I refused to let Angela and Mark's lies define me. Meanwhile, Mr. Douglas and I sharpened our strategy, gathering sworn statements from neighbors, church friends, and even former colleagues who testified to my clarity and independence, until our case file swelled thicker than the Bible in my living room. And when the next court date arrived, we marched in, armed with truth. Yet Angela and Mark, relentless in their arrogance, escalated further by attempting to liquidate one of William's old retirement accounts without my knowledge, forging my signature on forms they submitted to a financial firm. And it was only by sheer chance, because the young clerk handling the file had once been a student in my third-grade class, that the forgery was flagged, sparking a fraud investigation that threatened to unravel everything they had built for themselves. When I confronted Angela about it outside the courthouse, her mask finally cracked, her voice low and venomous as she hissed, "Do you know how embarrassing it is to have a mother like you? You should have just signed everything over and spared us all this drama." And for the first time, I didn't feel sorrow. I felt fury, a righteous blaze that burned away every lingering illusion of the daughter I thought I knew. And I leaned close enough for her to see the steel in my eyes as I whispered, "No daughter of mine talks about her mother like that, and you will never get what you're after." The final blow to their crumbling scheme came not from me, but from Ethan, who, summoned by the court to speak in chambers, told the judge in his small, wavering voice that he didn't understand why his parents said Grandma was sick when she always remembered his soccer games and homework, and that he just wanted to keep seeing me. Words so pure and devastating that when the judge emerged, he looked at Angela and Mark with open disgust, warning them that if they continued their campaign, he would consider sanctions for abuse of the legal system. Walking out of that courthouse, the spring air sweet with magnolia blossoms, I felt for the first time in months that the tide had truly turned, that their lies were collapsing under the weight of truth, and though I knew they would not give up easily, I also knew that I had survived the worst of their storm, standing firm not just as Margaret Anderson, mother and grandmother, but as a woman who refused to be erased, a woman who would carry her dignity intact, no matter how hard her own flesh and blood tried to drag her into the shadows. By the time summer rolled around and the Texas heat pressed down on Cedar Hill like a heavy quilt, the war my daughter and son-in-law had waged against me had finally reached its breaking point. And though the scars of betrayal would never fully fade, I was ready to bring the fight to its rightful conclusion. After months of hearings, investigations, and sleepless nights, the judge called us back one final time. And as I sat in that polished wooden courtroom wearing William's old silver cross around my neck, I felt his spirit with me, steadying my hands as the ruling was read aloud. Angela and Mark's petition for guardianship was dismissed with prejudice, meaning they could never again attempt to strip me of my autonomy, and the court found sufficient evidence of fraudulent intent on their part to refer the matter to the district attorney. The words struck like thunder through the silent chamber, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a true weight lift from my chest. Though across the aisle, Angela sat rigid, her face pale with shock, while Mark muttered curses under his breath as though still trying to claw his way out of the hole he had dug. But the victory did not stop at the courthouse steps, because I had taken Mr. Douglas's advice and finalized my living trust, placing my estate in the hands of an independent trustee and naming Ethan as the primary heir, with instructions that funds be released for his education, his first home, and his children's futures, ensuring that the fortune William and I had built with sweat and sacrifice would never fall into greedy hands, but would instead nurture the one innocent branch of our family tree. When I signed those papers, sealing my legacy beyond the reach of betrayal, tears rolled freely down my cheeks, not of sorrow but of relief, because I knew I had transformed pain into protection, betrayal into resolve, and that Ethan would one day know that his grandmother fought not only for herself, but for him. Angela tried once more to worm her way back into my house, showing up unannounced with crocodile tears and empty promises that she had just been scared and didn't mean for it to go so far. But by then, my heart had hardened, and I told her calmly but firmly that until she sought forgiveness not with words but with genuine change, she was no longer welcome on my porch. And as she stormed off, muttering about ungrateful mothers, I realized I felt no more anger, only a deep, sorrowful acceptance that sometimes blood betrays and love must be severed to preserve the self. Life slowly returned to its rhythms after that. Church on Sundays, coffee with Mrs. Johnson on Tuesdays, tending to my magnolias and reading novels on the porch swing. But I was no longer the quiet widow who had once thought family could do no harm. I was stronger, sharper, a woman who had stared down the abyss of erasure and walked away intact. Ethan visited me often that summer, his laughter filling the house with the music of childhood. And one afternoon, as we sat on the porch sharing a watermelon, he looked at me with those earnest eyes and said, "Grandma, you're the strongest person I know." Words that stitched together pieces of my broken heart, reminding me that though I had lost a daughter to greed, I had gained something far more enduring. The respect and love of a grandson who would carry forward the truth of who I was. And so when neighbors whispered about what had happened, when church ladies shook their heads at Angela's downfall, I held my head high because I knew the story was no longer one of humiliation, but of survival, of dignity defended against impossible odds. And in the quiet of my evenings, when the sun dipped low and the cicadas began their song, I would sit in my rocker, gaze at the magnolia blossoms swaying gently in the warm breeze, and whisper to William that we had won, that our legacy was safe, and that no matter how cruel betrayal can be, there is no force greater than a woman who refuses to be erased, a grandmother who fights with every breath for the truth, and a soul who chooses, even in the face of heartbreak, to stand tall and unbroken.